just in case people are tuning in late, this is Maad. I'm in southern Arizona.
And this is Fritz. I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
So if you haven't watched the Tolkien show on our channel, take a peek at that, because this is a follow-up on it. It's not necessary, but it'll get you in the right mood for this. So I've been known to have very passionate views on hummus, which really strikes people as being odd. Why I would care about hummus when there's so many problems in the world. But it does mean a lot to me because of just in general, so much of Arab culture has been co-opted. And me as a Palestinian in particular, so much of it has been co-opted that I'm particularly sensitive to when we have our one chance to be visible. Hummus in the States, at least, is one of the most popular, probably the most popular vegan food. And it's becoming very socially accepted, whereas Arabs are not socially accepted. So this was, I thought, one of our angles to becoming more mainstream. And it's been taken away from us. And so the reason, I'll let you come in a second, Fritz, but the reason I wanted to tie this in to Tolkien, the conversation on Tolkien, we just had Fritz and I had this conversation a minute ago about how hard it is for an artist to put their guts into something and create something and then have it taken away from them and somebody else leveraging it and making a profit out of it without giving them proper credit. And hummus is one of those things that we're like, Arabs are really proud of, that we made hummus and it's amazing and we have it every day. And yet so many people are taking credit for hummus. And it's ridiculous to me. Fritz and I were talking about it before, that in the States, I've done this anecdotally, is I've asked maybe 50, 60 people, any chance I have, I ask people, have you ever had any Arabic food? And out of 50 or 60 people, I've never heard anybody say they've ever tried Arabic food. They don't know what Arabic food is. And most of them have had hummus. When I ask them, have you ever had hummus? They'll say yes, but they've never had Arabic food. And then there was this discussion on the internet about who really created hummus, which itself to me was really offensive. The fact that we're having that conversation, I thought was so offensive. The ridiculousness of it is just on its face. Hummus is an Arabic word. I mean, what more do you want than having the word itself be an Arab word and saying it's not an Arab food? So what the claim is, and you can read this, you can do your own search. A lot of people are claiming hummus is Greek, that the Greeks invented it thousands of years ago. So why would somebody in Greece make this invention and then choose to call it an Arab name unless they borrowed it from an Arab country? So why are we having this conversation? Why is it debatable whether hummus is Arab or Greek or Turkish? It's an Arab food. End of story. I don't know, Fritz, does it seem strange to you that I would get so upset that somebody's taking credit for something my culture has created? Does it seem like it's over dramatic?
No, I mean, well, first of all, I want to say that you could have used the opportunity to use the word of the moment, cultural appropriation.
Yeah.
So
there's nothing left to appropriate.
So this is a case. No, but I'm saying this is a case. This is a case where you're filing a complaint of cultural appropriation. Absolutely. And the hummus is
particularly for Palestinians who our land has been appropriated. It's being appropriated every day. We're being wiped out. We had Golda Meir, who's considered a hero by many Americans, who was a former prime minister of Israel, saying there's no such thing as a Palestinian. You can look it up. She said that there's no such thing as a Palestinian. And then they take away everything that it means to be a Palestinian, which is our food, our dress, everything. They're saying it doesn't exist, and they've taken it for themselves. People think falafel is an Israeli food. People think hummus is Israeli food. It is now after they took it from Palestinians. And
well, what is the actual history that you do want?
Right. Yeah. So this is important to share because there are nuances. So people, and it's restaurants have this problem also. Is like what do you call a restaurant that serves hummus so it's actually not. Arab is too broad of a term. It's actually hummus is not an Arab food. It's food from the Levant. Levant is Syria, Palestine.
Lebanon.
You might throw parts of Jordan in there and Lebanon. So all of that area was the Levant.
Basically, the area that touches the eastern side of the Mediterranean.
Yeah,
it borders the eastern Mediterranean.
Right, and that's why I was hesitant about throwing Jordan into it. It's a good question. So let's go back a little bit further about what it means to be Arab. So the definition of an Arab is you speak Arabic, the Arabic language. So Sudan, and it's not just parsing words. We really believe, as Arabs, we really believe in this kinship with other Arabs. Like I feel a kinship with somebody in Sudan as a Palestinian because they also speak Arabic. That's their first language. So growing up, we had a boy from Sudan who I felt was an Arab just like I was. Somebody from maybe a neighboring country in Africa, and I wouldn't feel that kinship. So there is a historical kinship also, is that the reason all these countries speak Arabic is because of the Muslim Empire, which spread from the Arabian Peninsula. So they have this shared history as well, is that they're all part of this Muslim empire that once existed, where Arabic was the common language. All right, so when an Arab, when somebody says hummus is Arab, even though historically I think it's you might want to there weren't countries thousands of years ago, as you know. It was much more fluid. So that region, the Levant region, might stretch down, a lot of commonality might stretch down to Egypt, parts of northern Egypt. The Sinai area is a connection between Levant and Egypt. So a lot of people will say hummus actually is thousands of years old, that it originated in Egypt, but in that general vicinity. So it does not offend me if somebody in Saudi Arabia claims hummus is Arab, even though it's not a Bedouin food. There's the whole, quote, Persian Gulf countries, which are Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain. You might even throw Iraq into that. Those countries have their own culture, just as the Levant countries have their own culture. They look different. They tend to be darker. The Levant areas tend to be much lighter. But if somebody in Saudi Arabia says hummus is Arab, I would not be offended, because they're appealing to the same legacy. They're not stealing it. They're not just flat out stealing it out of nothing. It's like hummus became part of the Arab culture. They're broadly saying, it's an Arab food, even though if you want to, get into the weeds, you'll say, well, it's not all of Arabs that invented it. It was invented in the Levant, but it's part of the same legacy. So I don't feel that they stole it. They borrowed it. It's more like borrowing it. Where if somebody from Israel comes from Europe and says hummus is ours, it's like you discovered hummus when you came 170, 80 years ago to the region, right? Israel didn't exist before 48. This immigration started in the 20th century. Hummus has been thousands of years old. If you want to claim that, well, Israel existed 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, and they had hummus then you would have to explain why hummus was not spread in the Jewish world in the diaspora. Where did it go? If they were eating hummus in Israel before the diaspora, why is there no hummus in Russia? Why was there no hummus, in the U.S. when there was a big Jewish community there, because it didn't exist then. It wasn't an Israeli food. So that is far more offensive to me. As somebody come out of nothing, take our food that we've had for 1,000 years and say it's our food. That really bothers me. And it ties into what we're saying about music, about everything else, is when you create somebody and somebody uses it to create something better, you're saying, okay, that's all right. You can live with that. You're Italian. What if it's, Americans took pizza and they changed it? You've had pizza in Italy. It's a piece of bread and tomatoes. It's nothing like the Chicago pizza, New York pizza. I can't imagine as an Italian, you'd be offended if somebody called it New York pizza, because they've made it different. Yeah. Right. But here you have somebody coming from the West, taking our food, not changing it an iota, and saying it's their food, and you get no credit. You come to the States, you ask anybody where's hummus from, and nobody says it's Arab. That's where I get offended.
No, I'm not surprised that you're offended. I'm surprised that people don't consider it to be, well, okay, I'm a little bit surprised. First of all, I don't know that many Americans, at least, consider it to be Israeli. And is that the response?
What about falafel? Would you consider falafel to be more Israeli?
No, I haven't thought about it, but I don't think that many Americans think of Israeli food at all. I'd be surprised if you encountered Americans, and now we're speaking Americans here, your experience in America. If Americans, yeah. I'd be surprised if they responded, if they have any idea what Israeli food is, so to speak.
I'm gonna Google what is Israeli food.
No, okay, but hold on a second. You're going to, but that's the opposite direction. If you ask somebody what is Israeli food, okay, they might say hummus. They might say, oh, Middle Eastern food. But your question was, if you were saying, you were going from the other direction. You were saying, okay, person X in Arizona, hummus. You've had hummus, right? Or no, actually, I'm sorry. You started off by saying you asked them if they've had Arabic food.
Any Arabic food.
And they say no. And then you say, well, you've had hummus. And they say, oh, yeah, of course. So then what's their reply? Oh, that's not Arabic. That's what?
Correct. Then I ask them, where do you think hummus is from?
And
the last person I asked said France.
France. What's the most common response?
I've heard Greek, Turkish. Turkish is not the most common. It's the closest one, the most acceptable one, but typically Greek.
You don't hear just Middle Eastern in general? This
very rarely.
Really?
I've heard Middle Eastern, but usually not Middle Eastern. Usually it's like Greek or something like that. I've heard Mediterranean. Mediterranean may be the most common. Maybe the most common answer is Mediterranean.
Well, that
hummus is not Spain or Italy. It's
I understand, but that's sort of understandable in the U.S. given the proliferation of restaurants that advertise Mediterranean menu.
Right. Absolutely. So, and that's where half the
that's why I'm saying that I wouldn't expect anybody in the U.S. to say Israeli, because you don't see Israeli menu anywhere unless it's a very specialty place like in
I don't know where
San Francisco or New York.
Yeah.
But you do see a lot of Mediterranean is a popular thing. Now, to be honest, Mediterranean is a fairly recent, category in the U.S. Like when I grew up, I've seen the evolution, if you will, of the food terminology and food branding in the U.S. from the time when I grew up, when I was a child, the only ethnic food available was Chinese and Italian.
Right.
That was it. Chinese, Italian. Then along came Indian, and then along came at least in the New York area, there was Greek because of Euro, and then there was also what was branded as Middle Eastern, as I recall, for the most part, like souvlaki, and then and hummus, etc., was usually positioned in falafel. They were, to my recollection, at least in, say, the 80s, they were being branded as Middle Eastern more often than not.
I think that's more
maybe
coast,
East Coast or New
yeah,
York
East Coast.
area.
I don't think that to this day.
And then, but time out. And then in like the 90s and 2000s, there started to be the popularization of this food in terms of being called Mediterranean.
Yeah.
So Mediterranean, but I'm pretty sure that Middle Eastern and Greek existed in the US restaurant world prior to this term Mediterranean. Mediterranean was like, kind of the main street when it became more, when it became
more acceptable. Well, I think it was a health
when
thing.
not,
It was like,
when places were open that weren't mom and pop places owned by either, people from the Middle
Right.
East or from Greece
it's more
itself.
palatable. It's more palatable
Yeah,
to
the
American
popularization
taste.
of it became Mediterranean.
Yeah, it's more palatable politically to call it's not palatable to.
Well, I would say
Iraq.
I would argue a little bit that there is this Mediterranean menu which would include a little bit of everything. Like, for example, a menu that includes falafel, hummus, and baba ganoush, but also moussaka. What are you going to call that? You're going to call it.
Absolutely, you can call it Mediterranean.
Yeah.
But what I see is that there's just no credit given to the Arab part of that dish.
No, I'm not disagreeing with you on that. That's true. But I'm just saying that Mediterranean is a legitimate catch-all.
It can. There's appropriate times where you can call your restaurant Mediterranean. You can appropriate times you can call it a Mediterranean platter. Yeah. I'm just saying when you do that, you have to give credit. And this goes back to our conversation we had about Tolkien, is you can copy somebody if you give credit to that person.
Sure.
And no credit is given to where these foods came from.
Yeah, I hear you. So I mean, I think I understand what you're saying, because, for example, in a Mediterranean restaurant, if it just in the menu where it describes moussaka, they would typically say a famous Greek dish, right? And Greek salad.
Nobody ever says Arab. But
so in the case of hummus, why aren't they saying it's an Arab dish or a Levant dish?
Never say that. But half the blame goes to Arabs themselves, because they open restaurants. There's some really good Arab restaurants. They'll never call themselves Arab. They'll call themselves at most Middle Eastern, but typically, more often than not, it's going to be Mediterranean. And what's funny is that I know an Arab activist friend of mine who opened a restaurant, and he called it a Mediterranean restaurant. It's just they have the sense that people there will have an aversion to anything Arab. And this coincidentally, this last weekend, I do a food truck as a sort of like a hobby on weekends. And I served, I did a big sign, maybe just as an experiment, as a precursor to this show. I did a big sign saying Arab Meza, big print, Arab Meza, and then listed baba ganoush, hummus. I didn't think I have tabbouleh, but I had like six dishes that I listed as part of the Arab Meza. And it drew people. It drew because nobody, like I said, nobody knew what Arab food was. So rather than saying, oh, it's Arab, I don't want to deal with something Arab, they were curious, what the heck is Arab food? I've never heard of it. So I think there's a lot to say that the Arabs themselves are to blame, because they haven't taken the risk to just introduce people to these foods, because they say, well, they don't know Arab food, they don't like Arabs, so let's just call it something neutral like Mediterranean. The reason I don't like the term Middle Eastern is Middle Eastern includes countries that don't share the same cuisine as Arabs. Persian cuisine is completely different.
Yeah.
Turkish cuisine is similar because as you know, the Ottomans ruled the Arabs for hundreds of years. So a lot of excellent Arab food, or food Arabs eat, comes through Turkey, but it's distinct. There's distinct food that you can say this food is Arab and this food is Turkish food.
So let me understand. So if there was a mixed menu that included Arabic food and Persian food, you would agree that would be called Middle Eastern.
It would only be accurately called a Middle Eastern restaurant. That's the only thing you could accurately call it. And the same with Turkish. And Middle Eastern includes Israel. So now you have a completely different cuisine, because Israeli cuisine has no legacy in common with Arab cuisine. They've co-opted a lot of food. They have their own food, but it's not a common legacy. At least in the Turkish example, there is a common legacy. And then there's a spectrum. As you go from the Arab world to Iran to Afghanistan, there's common threads there. So they borrow things from each other, but they're not. It's not the same food. I don't think. The Arabs and the Persians, Iranians, share a lot in common. There's a lot in legacy in common, but they're very different also. And I think if you call an Iranian an Arab, I think they would take offense to it. I don't think they would like that very much, because especially the quote Shah Iranians, the people that supported the Shah, really see Islam as the onset of Islam, which again is a big part of the Arab heritage. It was spread through Islam. All right, I don't know how we got onto numbers. So I was just saying the difference between Middle Eastern, which includes Iran, Israel,
right,
and Turkey,
right,
which have different legacies. This is all very strange in some respect, which I have a hard time getting my head around. There's such a huge difference in culture between somebody from Lebanon and somebody from Saudi Arabia. They couldn't be more extremely different, yet they commonly call each other Arabs and have this Arab brotherhood. Politically, they don't, obviously. There's a lot of conflict within countries. But in terms of the people, somebody from Saudi Arabia could go to Lebanon and feel perfectly at home. They would feel that this is their home. Whereas, somebody from Turkey visiting Lebanon would have a much harder time, even though, they're much closer together and they probably have a lot more in common culturally.
I'm just curious. So the people who are the Lebanese, what's the Christian sect in Lebanon? The Phalangists. Do they?
Oh, the sect, the Maronites.
Christian
Maronites, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Phalangists is the political designation.
No, yeah. The Phalangists is actually their quote military when there was a civil war.
So the Maronite.
Maronites, yeah.
Maronite Christians. So do they consider themselves Arabic or Arabs?
Everybody in the Arab world considers them Arabic except for themselves. For themselves. They call some of them. I don't want to generalize. Some of them aren't comfortable being part of the Arab world, and call themselves Phoenicians. I don't know what the legacy of that is, but there was a big joke. It was a big joke in the Arab world is that, I'm not Arab, I'm Phoenician, because they're just too embarrassed to call themselves Arabs. You're Arab, all right? You're right in the middle of the Arab world. Lebanon is an Arab country. You're not Phoenician. So that was a big joke, and I don't want to generalize because because it is very political and.
No, you don't. You can generalize you can tell us. I think people would appreciate your take, as a native, your perspective, right? So, these things are fluid. I'm just telling
you how I feel. So, like, if somebody in Lebanon, which just happens quite a bit, claims that hummus is a Lebanese dish, I don't get offended by it because I think they're part of the legacy I'm talking about. They're
the Levant.
The Levant, yeah, they're part of it. It's not Lebanese,
and it's a very small. To be honest, geographically, the Levant is tiny.
It is tiny, and Lebanon, precisely Lebanon, shouldn't be talking about distinguishing themselves. And this is what would upset a lot of Lebanese. I think we are abiding by these lines that were drawn in the Sykes-Picot Agreement by the Brits and the French. Yeah. That to me, Levant is a region. It's a contiguous area. The people look similar, they talk similar, they eat similar. It really should just be one country called the Levant. And Lebanon really hates that idea. They really don't like to be lumped in with the Syrians. Nobody's talked about lumping in Palestinians with Lebanese. We have a lot in common with the Lebanese, but this is where the politics plays a role. Is, do you benefit as a country in the Arab world from there being an Arab world, or does it hurt you? For the Palestinians, who has zero power, we desperately need the support of an Arab world. So we believe in the concept of an Arab world. We believe in a concept of a Levant, which includes Syria and Lebanon. Many Lebanese want to stay independent of the Levant. They see themselves as being different than Syria. And it's just, and of course, you can always find differences in different regions, that they have different clothes, but fundamentally, the Syrian and the Palestinian and the Lebanese dress, they all have distinctive embroidery, but it's kind of all the same dress, just different embroidery. So the distinctions to me are really minute, but the politics plays a big role in how people perceive themselves vis-a-vis the Arab world. It's, do you need the Arab world or not? If you're Yemen, you kind of need support of the Arab world.
It's these cross identities. So everybody has multiple identities. So you have the ethnic identity and you have a national identity. So it seems like you're saying the Lebanese want to assert their national identity over everything else. But I got a question for you. To me, it's not that surprising, given that people grow up in nationalism is a powerful thing, and people are saturated with it. So the only thing that's larger than the national identity would be the religious identity. So right, so people would self-identify as Muslim, equally with their nationalism or more perhaps, but as opposed to regional is a little bit soft, at least now. But my question for you is, in the pre-colonial period or pre-post-colonial period, whatever, during the Ottoman Empire, for example, and before that, the Arab empires,
the Muslim empire, there's never an Arab empire per se.
Okay, all right, so the Muslim empires were so you would so what was the Levant referred to? Was it a sort of bureaucratically, organizationally, was it a region?
It was part.
Do you remember or not remember, but how?
No, there's a this is where language comes into play, and it informs us. Is that region was called Blad Sham, which means it's like the area of Damascus. Back then cities were much more prevalent in people's lives. So you had, Baghdad was a center, Cairo was a center, and Damascus was another center. So that whole region was part of Damascus in some way. Populations obviously were much smaller.
Including including Palestine. Palestine was associated with Damascus.
The Damascus region, sure.
Not with the Cairo region, or you said Cairo was the other big city?
Yeah, Cairo was always a big
city. The other hub, so to speak.
Yeah. So, and that's, if you were asking me what I would do if Sykes-Picot, the Brits and the French, hadn't carved up the Middle East, what would have naturally evolved culturally, I think, would have been 3 Arab regions. There would have been maybe countries, which you'd have North Africa, which is dominated in virtually every way by Egypt, with its base probably in Cairo. But it would basically, North Africa would be basically a bigger, greater Egypt.
Like the Maghreb, you would call, is that what's called the Maghreb?
Maghreb is part of it, yeah. So Maghreb is, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, all those countries. But they've never, the power base has always been Egypt in that region. For thousands of years, it's always been Egypt.
Okay, so you would have Greater Egypt and...
Yeah, Greater Egypt, but you made a good point. Maghreb is more like Morocco.
So that could be
which had its period of history, as having lived in Spain. The Moors, a lot of the Moors came from Morocco. But historically, Egypt has been the center of power for North Africa. You would have Syria, greater Syria, which again would offend the hell out of any Lebanese watching, because they have their own identity and they don't want to mix that in with the Syrian identity. But to me, they say the food is so similar, that the clothing is so similar, the ethnicity in terms of race is so similar. And then you'd have the third region, which is the Persian Gulf, and also very similar with the food, the dialect. I have a hard time understanding a Saudi dialect when they speak really fast. But
So
here's
you-
the interesting
So
thing
you would
about
wait, but time out. So you would say in this Persian, what you would consider to be the Persian Gulf region, that would include Iraq and Saudi Arabia and all
yes.
the Persian Gulf states and
Yeah,
Yemen.
if you look at the language, yeah, and they would call it the Arabian Gulf, by the way.
By the way, one thing I'm sure hardly nobody in the audience knows is what distinguishes Yemen, Yemen from Saudi Arabia, so to speak. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, there's no real distinction. It's just a line that was drawn literally in the sand.
So why is there
again,
such
there
a
are cultural
battle
differences. Yeah, there's you can always make cultural distinctions between the north
Sure.
and the south of the U.S.
Yeah.
You know, they speak a different language in Louisiana than New
Yeah.
York. You can always make distinctions, and you can make distinctions between a Yemeni and a Saudi in all sorts of ways. But from the outside, if you look from the broader perspective, they seem very contiguous to me. Like you said, the whole peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula, it's just hard to imagine why it got carved up the way. The United Arab Emirates, you know, how is that really different than Bahrain? And to somebody living in Bahrain, they'll say, oh, we're so different than the Emiratis, and we're so different to the Saudis. But from the outside, you because they have like this different headdress. It's red instead of green. But it's like from a distance, it's all really the same.
All right, I want to go
So
back to the
those three
hummus for a minute.
Yeah. So I was going to say that when Lebanese claim that hummus is their food, I don't get offended, as when somebody from Greece tells me, because they're not part of that legacy. They're not part of that evolution. They just came out of nowhere and took it from us.
Isn't that fairly? I mean, yeah, I don't. Is hummus in Greece a relatively recent thing?
No, it's historical. It could be.
Because of the Turks, probably because Greece.
They don't need the Turks. The Greeks were everywhere. They were definitely in the Middle East.
Well, they were, but the Turks then. Yeah, you're right. That's true. Okay, so that's interesting. But it's not. Is it on the? So is in Greek restaurants? Is it on the menu always in like strict Greek restaurants? Is hummus on the menu? I guess it is. I never thought about that.
It's odd to me because I would never have.
But falafel is not, interestingly, I think.
Yeah, I would never have associated hummus with Greece. I don't know because to me Greek food is moussaka, souvlaki. What are those Spanish things? Gyros too. I mean, yeah, those little triangles, spinach triangles, which I like.
Spinacopita.
Yeah, those are all like totally Greek. I mean, nobody's going to claim those are any other
Greek
country.
salad.
And yet they've taken all of our food. There's like nothing left for us. Baba ganoush, tabbouleh, all of this stuff. They took it from us.
All right, hold on. So but I was going to ask you though, how are chickpeas consumed in like the Persian Gulf, or well, maybe now hummus?
So it's the Arab world is very there's so much intermingling going on.
Yeah, but traditionally, like do you have any idea? Like, because you were saying that historically hummus was not
historically the whole peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula, was historically Bedouins.
Okay.
And so Bedouin food is very different than Levant food, which is on the Mediterranean. Bedouin food is like meat. They're one of their biggest dishes is a camel stuffed with a goat, stuffed with a chicken, a bunch of rice. They have some influence from Iran, I think, because a lot of their rice has raisins in it. And I know Iranian food has a lot of sweet. They use pomegranates and stuff. So there's a little bit of influence because they're contiguous with the Iranians. Levant doesn't have that. We don't do sweet stuff in our rice. We're not big meat eaters in the Levant. As you know, most of the Arab dishes are vegetarian, they're vegan. The hummus tabbouleh, falafel, all these things are vegan. We don't have a lot of meat. There's no room for cows.
What would you consider to be the Levant dish for lentil, or are there several?
No, there's one. It's and there's always an argument whether it's Palestinian, Lebanese, or Syrian, but it's one of my favorite dishes, and I love cooking it for Americans. They seem to like it. It's called the mujaddara, and it's a very common spice we use as allspice. So it's allspice with bulgur wheat. Are you familiar with bulgur? Or how do you pronounce it? Bulgur?
No, bulgur wheat. Yeah, I think
bulgur. Okay, so bulgur with it's just in a big pot and you mix it together. So it's called mujaddara, and it's topped with yogurt.
So the bulgur wheat and lentils.
That's vegan. It's always been vegan.
Bulgur wheat and lentils. Are they produced separately and then combined? Are they boiled separately and combined, or boiled together?
You start like most Levant dishes. You start with the onions in olive oil with the seasoning. So you get the onions absorbing all the seasoning as as they caramelize, as they caramelize.
Yeah.
And then
you use olive oil instead of not butter.
Everything. Olive oil and everything. There's no meal that doesn't start with olive oil.
Mm-hmm.
They've got tons and tons of olive oil there. And then you just put the rice and the lentils in, and you just keep it boiling for a while.
I'm laughing because one time I made a mistake of using olive oil instead of other oil in brownies, and it was terrible.
Yeah, it's got a very strong flavor. Yeah. Anyway, so you heat it all. It's a nice flavor with the allspice, and then but what makes the dish really good is you then caramelize separately. You caramelize a bunch of onions until they're really crisp, like beyond caramelized, and then you sprinkle that on the top. That's a
so. But the dish does it have a more westernized name to be used in? You never get it in restaurants in the U.S.
No, there's certain Levant food that I think is spectacular. For whatever reason, has never made it to the West.
Unless it's like a hardcore restaurant, you won't find it.
What you get in the States is fast food. Arab food. You get the fast food, the home cooked stuff. There's 3 main home cooked meals that you won't even find in Arab restaurants. It's just home cooked. That's the only place you're going to get it. That's mujaddara is one. Musakhan is another one, which is caramelized onions on a bread with sumac, and that's actually eaten with chicken. So it's a bunch of sumac, which is a spice you don't get here either. And the third one is called, the most famous Palestinian dish is called, which Syrians also do. They just have a little nuanced difference. It's called makluba, which is layers in a big pot of garbanzo beans, potato, eggplant, cauliflower, and rice. And some people put lamb, but as you know, I'm vegan, so I don't do that. So these are all in layers. And you have it in a pot in a low boil, and until the rice gets fully cooked. And so you have all this beautiful seasoning and flavors mixing together, but they keep their layers. And then once
keep the layers within the water.
Yeah, because you don't bring it to a hard boil. You very soft boil.
Simmer.
And you just have just enough water to cover the rice. And you keep adding water to make sure the rice.
But don't they all soften at different rates? So that don't the rice take the longest to kind of
absolutely.
Or the beans, the garbanzo beans.
Yeah, the garbanzo beans will boil on the bottom. So if anything, they're going to burn, which tastes good, by the way. But the potatoes take a while. So the potatoes and the cauliflower, I air fry. Most people fry before I put into this.
Today.
Right. So they're going to still be a little bit crunchy to eat. But like you said, they get a head start so that they're at the same pace as, let's say, the eggplant. If you cook eggplant too much, it just turns into mush.
Mush, yeah.
But so the beauty of this whole dish, which is why I think it'd be a great restaurant dish, is you get this pot about this big, a really big pot, And you've got to Google this if you have a chance to see how people make a big presentation about flipping the pot. You put a tray on top of the pot. So you take the cover off and put a tray on it.
Yeah, send me a video.
I'll send you it. And then you just flip it. And if you screw up the flip, you get food everywhere. So it's pretty dramatic. But I've seen some amazing flips where people will flip it up in the air, do like a double somersault, and then land perfectly on the tray. And then you lift it up and it comes out like a perfectly round cake. That's a dish that doesn't exist here. And yet it's one of the most famous Arab dishes. Yeah, I think there's an opportunity out there. If somebody wants to do an Arab restaurant with maqlouba, mjaddara.
I want to hear you pronounce hummus and baba ganoush and falafel as they would be pronounced.
Correct.
Yeah, in the same way you're pronouncing this other dish.
Yeah, so it's hummus. Hummus is garbanzo bean, and it's really strange because I tell people I have to soak the hummus. To me, I'm soaking the garbanzo.
Hummus. The word hummus is literally the same word as garbanzo bean.
Garbanzo. So I will soak the hummus overnight
to make your hummus.
Yeah, in order to make the hummus, and I can't get myself not to say that because that's what I'm used to saying. So, to somebody non-Arab, saying you can soak the hummus.
But that's very intelligible still to my ear. Continue with the other one, hummus? Like baba ganoush and falafel.
Baba ganoush.
Baba ganoush.
Baba ganoush.
Baba ganoush.
Yeah, ganoush is not an Arab word.
So what I'm getting at is how would you Westernize the pronunciation of the other dishes that you mentioned, the three? That's what I'm curious, because I couldn't repeat the word that you gave me for the lentil dish.
Baba ganoush to me is like impossible, but somehow people try to do it, right? You've heard of baba ganoush before, right?
Well, I say baba ganoush.
Ganoush?
That's how it's, I believe that's how it's, listed in most menus, and that's how most at least Americans say baba ganoush. Baba ganoush.
That's odd.
With a G.
Maqlouba is pretty easy. Falafel is, that's pretty easy.
Yeah, but I'm asking you to go the other way around. I'm not expecting, to be honest, most non-Arabic people who don't speak Arabic aren't going to be able to pronounce the sounds in the Arabic fashion. So what I'm saying is, there's already been an effort to westernize the pronunciation of falafel, baba ganoush, and hummus. What would you do to westernize the other ones?
Right, in the food truck, I just call it baba.
No, what would you call the lentil dish?
Yeah, mjaddara. That's
what I'm saying. What would you do to modernize that? To westernize it? Well,
I'll just call it the lentil dish.
No. You're missing my point. I'm saying
change the word mjaddara to something legible.
Well, that's why I asked you what baba ganoush had been, because I thought maybe baba ganoush was super extreme and they kind of softened it, if you will, for a non-Arabic tongue.
Ganoush, and ganoush is not a familiar Arabic word to me, so I actually just Googled it while you were talking, because I was wondering maybe if it was taken from somewhere else. The Google said baba ganoush is from the Levant, which I give them credit for not saying it's Arab or whatever. They just flat out said it's Levant.
You hadn't heard Americans saying baba ganoush?
Yeah, a lot. Okay. I hear them saying a lot. I didn't know, but I don't know what the word.
You didn't know it referred to what you call.
Sure, I knew it referred to. I didn't know what the word ganoush means in Arabic. I know baba means father.
Okay. Now you're going back to a different. Etymologically, you don't know the meaning of the Arabic form of ganoush.
Yeah.
Which is not, you're not saying ganoush, whatever.
What does baba ganoush mean in Arabic? So according to Google, baba means father, like I said.
Yeah.
And ganoush, I knew it. I didn't think this is what it meant. Ganoush is somebody being overly cute, like cutesy. Cutesy is the best analogy. So, but I didn't think that cutesy, that's what it meant. But that is what it derives from. It does derive from the word. So it's cutesy dad. It's an odd, that's what I would have guessed, but I wouldn't have said that because it doesn't sound right, but that's what it is.
What about the lentil dish?
Mjaddara. No idea
No
what
idea.
mjodara means.
Yeah.
Makluba is easy. Makluba is the layered dish. It means upside down because you flip
Oh,
it.
okay.
Makluba just means to flip,
Yeah.
flip upside down.
Yeah. Well, I did tell you, I thought that in Brazil, they do refer to Arabic food as Arabic food, or comida árabe. Although, and they have a lot of Lebanese.
Yeah.
Did you know that Brazil has a
Yes,
lot of
I did.
Lebanese? I mean, the Lebanese are powerful.
Yeah.
They're like politically, I mean, in terms of they're not necessarily, I don't know if they still, I don't know if there's such a thing as a Lebanese community, if you will, but there are definitely people who are of Lebanese descent who have become very powerful in the professions and politics and profession. In fact, the previous Temer, Michael Temer was, or Michael Temer was a Lebanese, I believe, descent.
Yeah, there's not that sense of aversion to anything Arab.
Do you know why that happened though? The Arabic or the Lebanese
Why
diaspora migration to Brazil? Brazil's got a very, I shouldn't say odd, but they have different immigration patterns than in like the US. They don't have Irish. They have lots of Italians. They don't have any Irish. They have lots of Lebanese. They don't have nearly anybody else that I can think of from the Levant. Well, they have some Jews, although I don't know that they came from Israel. And they have almost no Indians.
Yeah, the most
and no Greeks.
Yeah, the most populous Arab country is Egypt. The U.S. actually does have quite a few Egyptians, and with your neck of the woods in the Northeast, like New Jersey, Patterson. There are a lot of Egyptians there, but like Brazil probably doesn't have many Egyptians.
Not that I know. I only ever hear of Lebanese in terms of but that's strange. I mean, but to your, I mean, I guess you'd be happy to know that instead of they don't call it Lebanese food, which you might think they might, given the the prevalence of Lebanese. They just call it Arabic food.
Yeah.
By the way, I did read a novel from the famous Brazilian author Jorge Amado, which was set in the northeast of Brazil in the 1920s or so, and they referred to they referred to people as Syrians.
Yeah, which is what I was saying, because that's
exactly to your point, right? And I'm not sure if they were quote unquote Syrians in our sense of the word, or whether they were they might have been Lebanese who were being referred to as Syrians at that time,
right? Which I as a Palestinian would have no offense to that. If all of a sudden I was a Palestinian Syrian, I'd be perfectly comfortable with
do you have any sense of affiliation with the Assyrian Empire, which was a pre-Islamic empire?
Yeah, it's a different culture
altogether. There was no relationship. It's just that it was a geographic. I mean, the people who were Assyrians may have evolved eventually into.
It's a different legacy which crosses paths. You'd say that about the Kurds, the Armenians.
But the Kurds and Armenians continued as as separate ethnicities. Did the Assyrians just become Syrians?
There's hardcore Assyrians.
Oh, there are Assyrians.
Absolutely.
Still.
Absolutely. They would call themselves Assyrians. Yeah, definitely. They don't have a country.
But are they mostly in Syria?
No,
or they're
I
spread
think
out.
there's a lot of Assyrians in Iraq.
In Iraq?
Yeah. And they're very, we've got to wrap this up.
All right.
This was a precursor to, I think this may be the Hummus show. I don't know if we're going to have another Hummus show. Okay. So signing off. This is Maad.
You got to come up with a catchy title for it to go viral.
The Hummus show isn't catchy enough?
I don't know. It could be.